Sometimes you stumble across a phrase, something seemingly straightforward, and it just opens up this whole rabbit hole.
Absolutely. Like that quote, "And you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free."
Exactly. And finding it etched in the lobby of the CIA's original headquarters building,
Yeah.
well, that definitely makes you pause. Apparently, Alan Dulles himself insisted on it.
Yeah, the context there is loaded, isn't it? What truth, what freedom, especially in that building. It's a great hook.
It really is. And it led us, thanks to some of you listeners pointing it out, to this fascinating article by Peter Duke over at thedukereport.com.
Ah, yes. Duke's piece. It takes that quote and, well, it goes much deeper than you might expect. A really surprising perspective.
Totally. He connects it back to Jesus, but maybe not in the way most people think about it.
Right. He argues that Jesus wasn't primarily teaching theology, but rather a specific, practical linguistic method.
A linguistic method. Okay, so that's the core of what we're diving into today. We're going to unpack Duke's argument, looking at how he uses, linguistics, epistemology, history,
All sorts of things.
to explore this idea. It's about how this supposed method relates to finding truth, but also to power and control.
And just to be clear up front, because Duke emphasizes this too, he's presenting this as a structural analysis. It's not about pushing a particular religious viewpoint, more about how language and ideas function, sometimes against established power.
Exactly. So for those of you who shared the article, this deep dive is for you. We'll walk through the main points, try to connect the dots without getting bogged down. It seems complex, but the core ideas are really compelling.
Definitely. Let's dig in.
Okay, so the central claim, Duke's big argument. Jesus taught a linguistic method, not primarily the theology. Can you expand on that a bit? What does he mean by method?
Well, Duke frames it as something very practical, almost procedural, a way of using language and reason. Logos and crisis are the key terms he uses.
We'll get to those in a sec.
Right. But the goal was achieving, let's call it epistemic clarity, a clear way of seeing and understanding truth directly for yourself. Less about belief, more about process, personal transformation through clear thinking.
Okay, so logos and crisis, you mentioned them. These Greek terms seem central to Duke's whole framework. Let's break them down. Logos first.
Sure. Duke argues logos is way more than just word, which is how it usually gets translated. It's more like reason, structure, proportion, the underlying logical fabric of reality and how we articulate it.
So the inherent structure of things and our ability to reason about it.
Kind of, yeah. And then there's crisis. He says its original meaning was closer to discernment, judgment, the ability to distinguish, to separate things out clearly.
Not like our modern word crisis meaning a disaster.
Exactly the opposite, in a way. Duke points out that crisis originally meant that moment of decision, of judging or discerning. The modern meaning, he suggests, flits it into something passive, something that happens to you.
Huh? That's interesting. So Jesus, according to Duke, was teaching people to use logos, reason structure, and crisis, discernment, to what? Reframe how they saw the world.
Pretty much. To align their perception with God or truth or natural law, Duke makes a connection there to the American founders, their phrase, the laws of nature and nature's God. He sees a parallel in trying to grasp fundamental truths through reason.
Okay, so if this method empowers individuals to use reason and discernment to find truth for themselves, I can see how that might rub some people the wrong way.
That's exactly Duke's point. He argues this was perceived as a major threat by the established powers, think temple priests, Roman administrators.
Why a threat? Because it bypasses them.
Precisely. It's a distributed system, right? Epistemological autonomy, Duke calls it.
Mhm.
If anyone can access truth directly through their own reason and discernment without needing permission or an intermediary, well, that undermines the hierarchy.
Yeah, the gatekeepers lose their power if people can just walk through the gate themselves.
Right. And so Duke theorizes the response wasn't just disagreement, it was what he calls a containment operation.
Containment. Not refutation, but containment. What does that look like?
He argues the original message wasn't so much evolved as it was managed, institutionalized. They kept the figure, the icon of Jesus, maybe even elevated it, but they buried the functional method.
How? By making it mysterious.
Partly, yeah, shrouding the practical how-to in layers of theology, doctrine, and mystery, renaming things, reframing concepts, preserving the image, but disabling the engine, so to speak.
And again, he stresses this is a structural analysis of how power might react, not a comment on anyone's faith itself.
Correct. He's looking at the mechanics of control.
He uses this analogy of magic, doesn't he? Magic as manipulating belief. How does that fit in?
It's a potent analogy. He compares it to how a stage magician works, distracting you, hiding the obvious mechanism, using complexity and abstraction so you rely on them to understand what's really happening.
So hiding the simple truth behind complex rituals or doctrines.
That seems to be the idea. He argues that power structures, whether it's ancient priests using their knowledge of astronomy to seem mystical, or even, he suggests, modern complex systems like finance, they can rely on a similar dynamic, obscuring the underlying reality, making you trust the representation, the abstraction, rather than what you can figure out yourself.
Which leads into this concept of epistemological warfare, using language itself as a weapon to obscure reality.
Yeah, basically manipulating language and concepts to control perception and maintain power. He sees this happening in various institutions throughout history, maybe even today.
Who does he point to?
Oh, a range. He mentions established religions, obviously given his thesis, but also potentially things like legal systems, maybe even educational institutions or political ideologies. He also includes groups like secret societies or mystery schools, suggesting they capitalize on offering a kind of controlled pseudo-reality.
But Jesus' method, this logos in crisis thing, was the antidote to that.
That's Duke's argument. He portrays Jesus as actively dismantling that kind of obfuscation, speaking plainly, using reason, parables that encourage critical thinking, empowering people to see clearly and act freely based on their own understanding, cutting through the fog.
Now, Duke makes a really sharp distinction between freedom and liberty. This feels important. Can you unpack that?
Yeah, this is key. For Duke, freedom is inherent, it's unmediated, it's the right, maybe even the capacity to align your thought, speech, and action with truth directly, without asking permission from anyone.
Okay, so freedom comes from within or from nature or God.
Something like that. Whereas liberty, in his analysis, is often something defined and granted by an external authority, like the Roman Empire might grant certain liberties to its subjects.
So liberty can be given and presumably taken away.
Potentially, yes. He even gets provocative, questioning the word liberty on the U.S. Senate seal, pointing out the Roman numerals IX11 below it, and suggesting possible links back to this Roman granted liberty concept rather than inherent freedom.
That's definitely food for thought. Okay, so back to the reaction against Jesus' method. Duke frames it using that classic dialectic. Problem, reaction, solution. How does he apply that here?
Well, the problem from the establishment's view was this wave of autonomous thinking, this inherent freedom being unlocked, people thinking for themselves.
That's the problem they needed to solve.
Right. The reaction, Duke argues, was severe. The crucifixion, silencing the source.
And the solution?
The longer-term solution was to co-opt the message, reframe the teaching, abstract the figure of Jesus, make him divine in a way that requires mediation, and insert an imperial or institutional structure as that necessary mediator between the individual and the divine or truth.
So take a bottom-up practice of cognitive liberation.
And repackage it as a top-down system of belief managed by an institution. That's the core of his co-optation argument.
And language was the key tool for this repackaging. He talks about hermeneutics and semantic distortion.
Absolutely. Hermeneutics, the art or theory of interpretation, became crucial. By controlling the interpretation of Jesus' words, embedding them in layers of official doctrine, you control the meaning.
And semantic distortion. Just changing what words mean over time.
Deliberately, or perhaps sometimes gradually, but conveniently, shifting the meanings of key terms, especially through translation. This, Duke argues, was incredibly effective at disabling the original method.
He gives some stark examples, right? Can we go through a couple? Logos becoming verbum or word?
Yes. He argues that translating logos with its rich sense of reason, structure, cosmic order into the Latin verbum, and then simply word in English, well, it loses that depth. It becomes just a spoken or written item, not the underlying principle of reason itself.
Okay, what about Mennonite?
That's a big one for him, originally meaning something like change your mind, think differently, a fundamental shift in perspective based on reason.
It got translated into Latin as coenitentium agit.
Which means do penance. A huge shift. From an internal cognitive act, change your thinking, to an external act of contrition, often mediated by the church. It changes the focus from personal understanding to institutional absolution.
Wow. Okay. Any others that stand out?
He mentions ecclesia. Originally, it just meant an assembly, a gathering of people, like citizens called out to meet. It became ecclesia in Latin and eventually church, signifying a formal institution, a building, a hierarchy.
So from a group of people to an entity.
Right. And pistis, which in Greek could mean trust, reliance, faithfulness, often based on evidence or experience, became the Latin fides, leading to our word faith, which Duke argues increasingly came to mean belief without or even contrary to reason or evidence.
That's quite a shift.
He even touches on love. Greek had multiple words: agape, philia, storge, eros, each with nuances. Latin tended to collapse these into caritas or delectio, and English often just uses love. Duke suggests this obscured the specific, action-oriented, reasoned nature of agape as Jesus might have intended it.
It feels like a gradual blurring of the original precision.
That's precisely Duke's point, a semantic erosion perhaps that served to obscure the method.
He also connects this linguistic shift to the split between Eastern and Western Christianity.
Yeah, he posits that since the Eastern Church largely kept Greek as its liturgical and theological language, it retained more of that original cognitive structure, that emphasis on logos and crisis, maybe a more mystical but still reason-inflected approach.
While the West, relying on Latin translations,
Moved more towards metaphysics, dogma, and institutional authority as the primary guarantors of truth, because the linguistic tools for individual discernment had been, in a way, mistranslated or obscured. He even points to things like the Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople or the Council of Florence as moments of essentially epistemological conquest.
and he sees later groups like the Jesuits as refining these techniques.
Briefly, yes. He views the Jesuits, with their emphasis on loyalty, elite education, and sophisticated rhetoric, as becoming particularly adept at defending dogma and maintaining institutional control, rather than necessarily fostering that independent crisis or discernment in the way Duke defines it.
It's a controversial take, obviously.
Oh, definitely. His whole thesis is provocative.
He contrasts this with an insight from Dr. Wolfgang Smith about Eastern self-annihilation versus Jesus's approach.
Right. Duke references Smith to highlight a difference. Some Eastern paths might emphasize dissolving the self or ego, whereas Duke interprets Jesus's method, logos and crisis, as being about the perfection of the self refining one's ability to reason and discern truth, becoming fully realized, not annihilated.
He even brings in theosophy as a modern example of maybe missing the mark.
Yeah, he sees movements like theosophy, which try to synthesize Eastern and Western mysticism, as potentially repeating the old pattern, creating complex, abstract systems that, however well-intentioned, end up bearing the simple, practical method under more layers of interpretation and esoterica.
Okay, so let's bring it back to the core method. Duke talks about an internal Paschal structure that Jesus taught, like an inner death and resurrection.
Exactly. He suggests the original process wasn't primarily about the historical event, but an internal one available to everyone. The death is the letting go of old, false beliefs and assumptions. The resurrection and rebirth come through applying logos and crisis to achieve clarity and align oneself with truth.
And Christos, the Messiah.
He interprets that title not just as a unique historical figure, but potentially as signifying anyone who has successfully completed this internal process of transformation through logos and crisis. They've achieved that alignment.
Which is very different from the later focus on external rituals and Jesus as a figure requiring institutional mediation.
Immensely different. One is an internal, self-directed process of cognitive and spiritual refinement. The other becomes an externalized system of belief and ritual managed by an authority.
And Duke's view is that even the Protestant Reformation, while trying to break from Rome, didn't fully recover this core method.
He suggests that while Protestantism emphasized scripture and faith, it didn't necessarily reclaim that rigorous application of logos and crisis as the primary tools. This, in his view, might have contributed to its own fragmentation as interpretations multiplied without that shared method for discernment.
So after all this analysis of how the method was supposedly lost or obscured, what's the way forward, according to Duke? What's the call to action?
It's really a call for recovery, a conscious effort to reclaim and practice logos, our agency, through reason, clear thinking, structured thought, and crisis, our capacity for discernment, for making distinctions, for judging information critically and independently.
These aren't just historical concepts then, but vital tools for today.
Absolutely. He presents them as essential skills for navigating our current world, which is so saturated with information, misinformation, and, weaponized language. Reclaiming these is key to resisting manipulation and achieving genuine understanding.
He wraps it up with that magician analogy again, doesn't he? Power structures using linguistic tricks to turn truth into confusion.
Right. The ultimate illusion is making the simple seem complex, making the accessible seem hidden, controlling the narrative through language.
And the task is to see through the trick, to separate, as he puts it, the baby, the original practical method of Jesus from the bathwater of subsequent imperial or institutional overlays.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the potential distortion and trying to get back to the functional core, using our own minds, our reason, our discernment.
Okay, so summing up this deep dive into Peter Duke's articles from thedukereport.com, the main argument is that Jesus' core teaching was a practical linguistic method for discerning truth, using reason, logos, and critical judgment.
Crisis. And that this empowering method was, over time, contained, obscured, and co-opted, largely through institutionalization and the subtle but powerful manipulation of language and translation, shifting focus from internal transformation to external authority.
For you listening, especially if you're interested in getting to the core of complex ideas, Duke's perspective offers, well, a radically different lens. It challenges conventional views of history, religion, language, and power.
It really encourages a more active, discerning approach to, well, everything. How we process information, how we understand the structures around us.
So here's something to maybe chew on after this. How could you personally apply these concepts of logo-structured reason and crisis critical discernment more consciously in your own life?
Yeah, where do you see language being used perhaps to obscure rather than clarify? And how does Duke's distinction between that inherent internal freedom and the potentially granted external liberty resonate with your own experiences or observations?
It really pushes you to think about intellectual autonomy, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Where does your understanding come from? How much are you relying on your own critical faculties versus external narratives?
It's a challenge to take ownership of your own thinking process.
Definitely. And maybe we can end on that final line from Duke's piece, which has a kind of hopeful resilience to it. They can't stop the signal.
Implying that despite all the potential noise, distortion, and attempts at control, the underlying truth, or at least the human capacity for reason and discernment, endures and can always be recovered.
A powerful thought to end on.
This is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world.